Joyce Kaufman Show on News Talk 850 WFTM.
All right, welcome back. Of course, tragedy took place. Lots of tragedies took place, but the one that really impacted our emotions was the elderly patients who were inside of a nursing home in Hollywood, Florida, that were not receiving proper care, obviously, and it resulted in 9 deaths and a lot of questions, including questions from Florida's Governor Rick Scott and all of the relatives. So we bring in a legal expert. We bring Quentin Brogdon, is a civil attorney and a former prosecutor. And, of course, thank you for coming on the show, because I have been contacted by a number of listeners, many of whom had similar issues go on at other facilities. And really, you know, I'd like to know, what's the difference between being a mistake and being a negligence?
Good afternoon, Joyce.
Good afternoon.
What we have here is a completely avoidable tragedy. And we know, to a certainty, civil cases where the families of these 9 dead elderly patients are going to file for monetary damages, those cases are going to go forward. The only question is whether there's going to be also criminal prosecutions where people can face jail time or prison time. In Florida, the test for criminal in this kind of circumstance is whether the nursing home, the people who ran it, were culpably negligent. That's the term.
Okay.
And it's defined as consciously doing an act or following a course of conduct that the defendant, in this case the nursing home, the managers, must have known or reasonably should have known was likely to cause death or great bodily injury.
So, in other words, if they had no protocol to handle an emergency or were unable to enact that protocol, is that culpably negligent?
Well, it's a fact-specific determination. Our nursing homes are understaffed and often poorly staffed, and so this specific nursing home, I don't know details on that, but oftentimes we hear and we see about, you know, these patients not being taken care of at the level they should be taken care of. Mm-hmm. The prosecutors are going to be looking at the fact that 9 people died. It's one thing if a person or even 2 people died,
right.
Something was horribly amiss, and there's an air-conditioned hospital 50 yards away to which these people could have been moved, and it certainly was foreseeable. The power was out also for 3 days, so there was time, a lot of time that passed with no actions being taken. Mm-hmm. The hospital, on the other hand, or the nursing home, was going to say, well, we thought the power was coming back on imminently. We were in contact with the state, telling them about our circumstances, but interestingly, they never said they thought anybody was in danger. We were monitoring the temperature, at least for much of the time, and we say it didn't get over 80 degrees. Interestingly, when the firemen and policemen arrived, they said it was very, very hot there. And we were using coolers, fans, and ice. That's what the nursing home would say. So clearly they were negligent. Clearly, under the civil standard, failing to act as an ordinarily prudent or ordinarily careful nursing home, they failed that. There's just no question.
Right.
The question is whether it rises to the level of criminal, and ultimately the prosecutors have to decide whether to initiate those charges, and then a jury would have to weigh in based on these facts.
So do we need different kinds of, laws to protect these patients? Because, I mean, obviously there seems to be a lot of wiggle room here for prosecution.
When jurors weigh in on these kinds of cases, there's a lot of guilt and a lot of fear, because we fear that one day we may end up in one of these homes, and we have loved ones, parents, grandparents who are in these homes. And there's a lot of guilt and fear about how they're being taken care of, whether they're being taken care of appropriately. And in this case, clearly the nursing home let these patients down. And if 9 actually died, then many more than that were placed in serious jeopardy. And it's only by happenstance that more than 9 were not killed. So the nursing home clearly dropped the ball here. And there's a legitimate debate that can be had about whether it goes to that next level criminal. I know that the politicians are saying that, and they, cynics would say that's of course what they're going to say, because the constituents are enraged, and appropriately so. But legally, you can have a pretty good debate about this. There are factors, going both ways. I think there is a concept called gross negligence in civil law, and I think they're clearly grossly negligent.
Yeah.
And that means they pay extra monetary damages, punitive damages, if a jury decides they're grossly negligent. And I think in this case, the nursing home would be.
And I would assume it's not just the patients who perished, but patients who were impacted negatively. I mean, even if you survived but came close to dying, they had a number of patients in intensive care right after they were rescued. I mean, there's a case to be made that they should be entitled to a civil suit and maybe even a criminal suit.
Absolutely. Causation will be one of the issues. Some of the news reports said that the director of the ER at the hospital across the street, basically, where these folks were later taken, Dr. Randy Katz said that it was impossible to say whether any of the dead would have survived if they had gotten to the hospital hours earlier. So it's kind of a slippery slope. If the nursing home had acted, 5 hours earlier, how many lives would they have saved? If they had acted 10 hours earlier? And the nursing home, of course, will say, we can't know, it's not certain. On the other hand, the prosecutors and the families of the victims will say, they were deprived of the opportunity, and clearly you had people going to intensive care. You may have had people, I don't know this, but it wouldn't be beyond the realm of possibility. Someone had a stroke or a heart attack or something like that because of the exposure to the heat.
Yeah.
So, yes.
One other question.
A death.
Yeah, one other question that I had. I happen to know somebody who works in that hospital across the street, and they said to me, many of the people who were in that nursing home are actually patients of doctors who are at that hospital, and sometimes patients are placed in that facility after a hospitalization. Is there any culpability on the part of that hospital to not to have looked after the people who were their patients and were now in that facility?
Again, it's a case-specific analysis.
Mm-hmm.
My intuition tells me that would be a tough argument to make for the families of the victims, unless there's something in the nursing home's background or citations and there, that would have put the hospital or the doctors on notice that placing those patients in that particular nursing home was placing them in some kind of jeopardy or peril. And I think that would probably be a tough row to hoe. But, the hospital acted in an exemplary manner here. The minute, really, they understood the degree of the issue, they issued an all-hands-on-deck alert, essentially. And I think 100 or so nurses and staff from the hospital came running across the street to provide immediate assistance and to get folks out of that heat. So the hospital here, and a jury certainly would hear that. I think it would be tough to bring the hospital or the doctors into this case. I'm not saying impossible, but just tough.
Right. And again, that goes back to what condition was this facility in prior to the hurricane? Were there any questions about its suitability to house people and then to house them during a hurricane? I'm sure all of this will come to light, and it'll be, unfortunately, it's an interesting case, but a sad case to have to follow. If anything good comes out of it, I suspect that in the future, when threatened by a hurricane, a lot more of nursing facilities are going to have a protocol in place, which includes evacuating patients from there if they cannot guarantee. I mean, from what I heard, the generator was inside the building. Even that's questionable.
Yes, unfortunately, our society has to learn these lessons again and again and again. A number of years ago, I was involved in a case where nursing home patients were evacuated on a bus from Hurricane Rita between Houston and Dallas in Texas, and the bus caught fire and 23 of them died. And there was a lot of studying and discussion about that, but some of the same mistakes continue to be made. You have a very vulnerable patient population, vulnerable in that they're not very mobile, they can't be moved very quickly, they have predisposition, pre-existing medical conditions that make them vulnerable to heat and to other things. And so they have to be treated carefully, and you have to have plans in place.
Wow. Well, thank you so much for your expertise. I appreciate you coming on today.
Thank you, Joyce.
All right, we're going to take a quick break, and we'll be right back.